Hello and welcome to the Game Dev Garden, a podcast all about deep conversations, game development, curiosities, mental health, and wherever the dialogue might take us. But before we get things started, I'd like to give a huge thank you and recommendation to Plus Two Initiative, who has created some amazing and wonderful garden-themed lo-fi for the show. His Spotify is linked below, and he is available for a variety of work. And please do give him a look. He's a fantastic guy and a brilliant friend of the show, so thank you so much. However, without further ado, I would like to welcome today's guest. Steve Lee is a level designer, having worked on AAA games such as Bulletstorm, Bioshock Infinite, and Dishonored 2, while also working on some indie titles such as John Wick Hex and Alba, A Wildlife Adventure. Welcome to the show, Steve. It is such a pleasure to have you.
Hey, cheers. Cheers for inviting me on. It's good to be here.
So I'd love to talk just a little bit about your journey in games and some of the projects that you've worked on and your sort of story to where you find yourself today as a game dev.
So I've been in the industry for like getting on 14 years now, and it's been a kind of a mix of AAA to begin with and indie later on, and more recently moving kind of back towards bigger stuff. But like the first... So I don't know what's that really like. I came into games as I came into games kind of as a hobbyist level designer for like first person shooters. So I got started like making Doom levels and Quake levels and stuff like this, and Half-Life 2 stuff at university. And so I got into the kind of scripted AAA action game type angle. And my first game I worked on was Wheelman, and then I moved on to like Bulletstorm, which was my first person shooter. And then I wanted to move in a more story direction after that, so I remember it was Bioshock Infinite, and then Dishonored came out, and I was like, oh, that was amazing. That's the kind of game I'd love to work on. And so it's been kind of it might sound more, I think when I put it like that, it sounds like I had some kind of strategy or something, but really it felt like I was just getting to the end of every project and thinking, what do I do now? Like, what do I want to do next, and what makes sense? But I've kind of found myself moving towards these kind of like deeper, kind of slightly more story driven, kind of rich, immersive first person games. But then after that, I kind of felt like a real change, and I went freelance, moved back to England, and here in London, and I've been kind of contracting and doing more indie stuff lately. So I feel like I'm trying to basically try everything and figure out what kind of appeals to me most and what works for me in a way.
I feel very similarly about that.
Because there's a lot of pros and cons to every kind of gig in a way. There's things I like about AAAs, things I like about indie, and different AAAs and different indies are all, they all have their own pros and cons as well. But it's been nice to be able to appreciate both. I think it helps me remember that there's very few places that feel like the perfect gig, and you've got to always just appreciate what's good about each one. Hopefully there is something good about it,
but it's kind of you kind of sort of have to say, you kind of have to weigh out like which pros and cons mean the most to you and stuff. I've worked at a small company, I've worked at a medium-sized company, and now I'm working for a big company. And it's so interesting to compare them all and sort of see what works you, especially for me personally. And I think it's something you have to try out. If you only ever work in one aspect of the industry, you won't know. You kind of won't always have the personal perspective on whether it works or not for you.
Unless you're really clear-headed about what you want. Like I think a lot of people, for example, some people will get into it from the indie angle and just feel like, why would I ever go into AAA? I love the small thing I want, or they start their own company as their first thing, and they're like, why would I not be a part of my own company, kind of thing. But for me, M&A, I got into things when indie wasn't much of a thing. Like 13, 14 years ago, Unity didn't exist. There was no indie scene in the way that it was just starting to emerge, the indie scene, as when I was at university. So I got into AAA, and partly because I just, even now, there's this part of me that likes AAA in the sense that I like things to be the fullest, full fat version of that idea. I always think it's a bit of a shame if a game where you feel like this idea deserves a bigger budget than what it is when it's with certain indie games. But like Yeah, so there's not. I think I'll always be kind of umming and ahhing about the pros and cons of both because I think I'm very clear headed, but in different ways. Like I have a part of me that loves the indie thing and a part of me that loves the AAA thing, and I suppose it just depends on the project and the team. I suppose that's
Absolutely.
yeah. And maybe there's a sweet spot in the middle. Maybe my dream place is like 30 people. It's not like tiny indie and it's not massive AAA. I don't know. I've not really done that yet, I suppose. So
Yeah,
yeah.
double A is fun. So
Mm,
yeah, Minecraft Dungeons is probably considered a double A game, and there's a lot to love about it because you kind of have that indie flavor to it where someone can just be like, "Hey, I've got this crazy idea," and then you just assemble a group of people for a day and you make it and you just put it in,
mm,
which is really exciting. And it also has kind of some of the structure and routine and orderliness that comes with like a big scope of a project. And
yeah.
it's worth, yeah, I'd say, well, it's for me it was really exciting.
Yeah. It just seems like 20, 30, 40 people is where
Mhm,
where you're big enough to do something cool and kind of really flesh it out,
mhm.
but also you're not so big that the culture's changed into this thing where you don't really know everybody in the office and all this
That,
kind of thing, and
yeah, that is
that kind of
exactly what I
thing.
was going to say,
Um,
because you get to know everyone. You literally get to know everyone on the team. You have your like morning stand up, excuse me, and it can literally just be the whole team. You know
mm,
what everyone is working on.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah, totally. And especially now with COVID and stuff and working remotely, AAA remote sounds difficult to me. Like on the
mm,
full scale AAA
yeah,
sounds really. I suppose it depends on the discipline, but especially as a designer and the kind of lead level designer, I suppose. The idea of collaborating with
yeah.
hundreds of you. I've
It
never been on a team bigger than like 120 or so, but the idea of even 100 remote sounds challenging.
Yeah, one of the things, one of the interesting sort of things that I think is going to be a big change in a lot of AAA spaces is like how the idea of having everyone in a meeting room. I don't think that's going to be a thing anymore because now it's so acceptable to work from home, and a lot of people do that full time. Your meetings can't actually always be in a physical space anymore because not everyone's at the office, which is just a super interesting side effect.
Mm. Yeah, totally.
And
Yeah,
I
I'm
think
really
there is a
curious to
shame in
see.
it.
Yeah, well, that's it. Yeah, I'm really curious to see how it plays out because, again, it's the same thing. I see pros and cons. There are pros and
Yes.
cons to working from home versus being in the office, right? And I do, after all this time, like almost creeping up to a year and a half now, like I definitely do miss being in the office and playing the game on together,
Mhm.
when you're testing it and stuff like that.
Oh yeah.
Um, but yeah, it's a tricky one. Um, like I say, lots of pros and cons.
It's super like that. But yes, I'd love to. I've got a great question for you that I'd love to ask. So, in terms of your style of level design, it's quite systemic, and you've worked on a lot of systemic games, and that's super curious to me as a designer because a lot of level designers are big fans of the systemic driven system where you can build levels in a way that can really feel very gamey and meaty, and there's a lot of problem solving using the level design. And I'd just love to have a little chat with you about that.
Yeah, I mean, I love really, for what it's worth, I love really scripted stuff in a way as well. But
Mm,
I suppose I love the combination of the two. Like to me, that's what's really appealing about Dishonored 2 to me is that it's. I remember talking. I did a panel about systemic games a while back, and I remember talking about this where like Dishonored 2, and I kind of realized it as I was talking about it. Like Dishonored 2 is an interesting mix of it being very systems driven in some ways, but then also it's super handcrafted as well. It's not completely systemsy in the sense of like an indie procedurally generated roguelike is. You do have a team of level designers handcrafting the hell out of a level for a long time, and there's lots of scripted scenes and dialogue that you've crafted for that particular situation and all this kind of stuff. But like I say, it's a mix of the two where you're handcrafting a space to be an interesting place for emergent things to happen. And again, that mix of like some authored narrative stuff with very systemic gameplay, and even some kind of mix of the two, where like there's like the heart in Dishonored is always struck me as really interesting, where you could have the opposite as well, where you have a guard, an NPC guard who is kind of a generic guard, but then you can script him to be in a particular situation. I always remember there was a situation in Dishonored 1 where it was just they used the maid character, one of the maids, and the guard, and they just scripted it so that it seemed like they might have had a romantic thing going on, and you can overhear a conversation, um, and which is an interesting way to script two kind of generic NPCs in the first place. But then also because there's Dishonored, you have the hat, which you can use to kind of point at anyone and trigger I think fairly randomized line of dialogue about them, but very kind of character rich dialogue about them. And so you can watch the scene, and the guards, if you're playing it in a violent way, you might often kind of attack the guards, and you know that kind of thing. You see them as the enemy, but then the fact that they're in a romantic scene is one scripted thing that gives it different character. Where maybe you won't kind of attack him because they've got a thing going on, but then you could think that, and then you could point the heart at them, and the heart might say something really that makes that character sound really bad, and then you might change your opinion about him again based on a completely kind of systems driven character thing that was kind of projected onto that NPC. And so it's a really interesting mix of like handcrafted to hell, like really seriously handcrafted but then also deliberately embracing all of the systemic stuff that you can. And to me, it's that mix that is really interesting. And I find the games that I'm most into, Half-Life 2 is an interesting one, because to me, Half-Life 2 and Dishonored have a lot of similarities, despite Dishonored being on the more systemic side and Half-Life 2 being on the more scripted side. But there's still lots of game mechanics stuff in Half-Life 2, which is very systemsy. And they're both handcrafted, very handcrafted, but one of them is, like I say, more driven by systemic gameplay, and one of them more by scripted situations. So
Absolutely.
anyway, that was a long answer, but I love all that stuff, and I love the mix of the two. Yeah,
totally. Super, super rich answer, and there's loads of fun stuff to dive into there. And I also think, I think Dishonored and Half-Life in particular, they're kind of like leveled in a way. They're kind of level design driven games because what you're experiencing is so much like levels. Whereas there are some other games where it's less about it's a kind of less there's less focus and spotlight on the level. Whereas I think in particular with Half-Life and Dishonored, they're kind of stars of the show. They get a lot of love, and I really like that about them.
Yeah, and I suppose I'm going to be naturally, as somebody who has always came into the industry as a level designer, like I'm going to like the kind of games that have cool. I mean, it's a chicken and egg thing, right? I love those games because of the power of level design when a game kind of really takes advantage of it. But I also, it's like I'm naturally going to be attracted to those games now because I appreciate them as a level designer as well. But I agree. There are certain games that really do stand out as they feel level design driven in a way that like another one to me is like all the Call of Duty games and the and Titanfall and the Respawn games. They struck me as and like I remember thinking, what was it we chatted about? On Titanfall 2, that in their campaign, it was funny because there was this weird coincidence where Dishonored 2 and Titanfall 2 came out at roughly the same time. And both of them had a time travel mission and a kind of crazy transforming level mission. Yeah. And I remember I randomly met some of them at GDC, and it was a thing where both teams were like, what they've done our thing, and they happen to have come up with their own version of it, because obviously similar concepts, but at the heart of the games, like Titanfall and Dishonored, are quite different things. But I think that shows how, to me, that was a product of those games being sequels in AAA studios by level design driven studios, where I think to come up with those kind of missions, you would never come up with those missions, I don't think, if you're like coming at the project narrative first, or if like, I don't know, art first even. Like I think for those missions to come up, you'd need to ask the team of level designers, what would be the coolest missions to do? And it's the kind of thing where level designers will say, time travel is cool, that would be amazing, I'd work on that. And somebody else will say, oh, it'd be cool if the level transformed in all these different ways. And I just suspect that because I wasn't there at the beginning of Dishonored 2, I suspect that at the beginning of both of those projects, there was a brainstorming session with, or probably lots of them, with level designers, where those ideas came out, because they're very level designy ideas.
They
The idea
are
that, oh, it'd be cool if you had a level with time traveling. And so yeah, that's it. I kind of, like I say, I'm kind of biased towards games that can, where the level designers can really flex their muscles, and it makes a big impact on the player experience.
massively.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I want to just sort of talk about the sort of scripted and bespoke elements as well, because the scripted versus bespoke and that kind of dynamic as well, because it's so the thing about doing like any bespoke scene or moment in a game is they're expensive, and there's a lot of like so much polish goes into them because they're only seen once, and it's not being polished for other areas of the game, so it can take a lot of work. And I think that seeing the balance of those two things, like bespoke and scripted stuff, is interesting. It's super cool.
Yeah, and to me, it kind of comes down to, let me think. I mean, you need some authorship, in the sense that you need some sense that somebody's designed this experience that you're having benefits from having been designed
Yeah.
to be
Oh yeah.
cool and to be experienced in a certain way. But then also, because it's interactive, you need space for the player to feel like to drive the experience to some degree, and not just feel like dragged through a movie script, and so yeah, it just seems inevitable that all games have this balance, and it's a matter of how you traverse that kind of balance between the two. And obviously there's loads of ways to do it, different ways to do it. Everything from, like, I mean, even between two Naughty Dog games like Uncharted and The Last of Us, there's quite a wide spectrum there, where they do some very gameplay driven stuff and some non-linear stuff in the later Uncharted games, for example. But then there's stuff in The Last of Us which is like super, in a cool way, because they're putting loads of effort and money into it, and really fleshing it out. They're doing loads of super bespoke narrative stuff, which is more linear but cool.
Yeah, it's also an inherently unique problem to games as well, like, because you're trying to balance, like, creating like a very, like, this is the moment that we want all players to have, but then you want other elements where it can be like, well, the player can actually approach this in a few ways, and you would never have that problem if you were making a movie, because movies are linear, and for me as well, as a level designer, I kind of really like non-linearity and like choice in level design and spaces and stuff like that. And it's always and actually this actually ties back to some of the work I did on Sniper Elite VR, and it was, we would create scripted moments, but it would be really hard to get the player to be looking at the right location when those moments happen, because in VR, one of the big novelties, and I say novelties, it's actually one of the best things about VR, you can look absolutely anywhere. So there'd be like a plane crash or something overhead, and you have to put a lot of work into making sure that the player is going to actually see it.
I can imagine. Yeah, with that kind of thing. Yeah, a plane crash is maybe a good example, where you can imagine in a more linear scripted non-VR game, it would be all about, like, make sure the player's looking this way when this happens, and it all happens from this point of view. Whereas I can imagine in VR, it would be about 3D sound, and maybe the best thing you could do is have the plane basically crash above you in a way that you can't miss it, because it goes everywhere. It comes from behind and from the right to in front of you to the left, and that kind of thing.
And then you like use the level design space as well to sort of like make, there's nothing happening like to the left and right of you, and then you have all of the action is going on overhead, and that's the cool, that's one of the cool things about it. You literally turn your head, like, and that makes it like a cool VR moment, because you're using the inherent strength of the medium to empower the storytelling.
And I can imagine it in that moment, to be reacting in a kind of instinctive way to, like, in the way that you would in real life if a plane was crashing above you. That's like you say, it's the strength of VR. Like, I've not worked on any VR games, but it just sounds interesting. Yeah.
You would love it. I think you'd have a really good time with it. And sort of this sort of ties into my next question about you've talked about elegant design a little bit in some of your presentations and talks and stuff online, and I'd just love to have a little chat about why you think it's important for level design in particular.
Um, so the way I've kind of talked about, and kind of defined elegant design is just in terms of working in a way where you get the most bang for buck out of
Mm,
essentially the least work or the simplest work. Um, and I think that's just, I mean, it's important for game dev in general because game dev is so complicated, and scope is so kind of pervasive as like a nightmare if that goes out of control if you don't really keep an eye on it. In a way that I don't think is true of like films and music. You know, I don't think I don't I don't imagine that musicians often worry about like, oh man, we just started off playing a song, but then this song turned out to be 47 minutes long and we never finished it. Like it's just it's not how music works. Whereas game development can just explode into these giant projects if you're not careful and if you don't understand the implications of what you're doing.
mhm,
And so I think working elegantly in a way where like learning to be able to get a sense of what will be good enough and what is interesting that isn't an insane amount of work is just a really fundamental game dev skill. But in the context of level design, it's even more so. Like, and maybe with with a game like Dishonored, especially, I find another reason I like Dishonored is that and especially the first one, is that it feels super elegant in terms of how much richness it gets out of very simple things that would be really simple in isolation, but they
mhm,
combine to make an interesting experience. For example, like the idea of that the hat again, it's all
mm,
that is just a thing that where you can switch to that tool and you can point it at an NPC and it plays a random line of dialogue. But because that random line of dialogue is just full of character, it suddenly makes you feel like it turns a level full of generic NPCs, um, like often identical looking guards on patrol paths, into human beings. Like that you can imagine. I mean, you're told a story about every character that you pointed at, and it's just a very elegant way to elevate your NPCs to being something more than just generic guards. And and everything like to me like letting the player read notes in a game and therefore empowering the level designer to just have some written text in the game
mhm, mhm,
opens up these new doors to like whole worlds of description and kind of world building, which you couldn't do if you didn't have text in the game. And yet text is so cheap, like as far as game development is concerned. Like, I mean, narrative designers and writers might disagree with this, but relatively speaking, it feels like
yeah,
text is pretty cheap, right? And like, and yet it can also be it can also kind of describe things in ways that would either cost loads of money to do it in 3D or be impossible. You can describe impossible things in a few lines of text that again just expand the world of the game um, so elegantly. Like I say, you get so much bang for buck out of a simple tool.
mhm,
And so I love Dishonored for being, to me, it's just a massive collection of all the elegant tools that just give level designers the potential to do something really interesting when you combine them all together. And and that is ultimately what level designers do, right? We just try and we essentially have a toolbox, like a Lego box full of pieces and tools and stuff, and it's like our job is, in a way, it's like, okay, what can we do with these? What's the coolest thing we can do with this selection of Lego pieces, essentially? Whether it's like notes or 3D art or patrol path feature, AI features, player mechanics and stuff like this. It's like, what's the coolest thing we can do with all of these different pieces? And so, the more you can think about how you can get achieve more with less, essentially, the more you can do, right? It's just a really fundamental skill, I find. And like I say, especially with video games where things are a train wreck if you don't manage to see scope properly, and also everything just is complicated. So like the more you can reduce that chaos, the more the more sane you can stay, and the more kind of you can achieve, hopefully, with your work. So
absolutely.
I like to bang on. I'm actually thinking about talking about elegance as one of my next videos because it's kind of a big thing for me. And just it
It is
resonates
no,
with a lot of stuff for me.
likewise, I love the analogy of the Lego kit as well, because that's kind of how I got my start into sort of doing this sort of thing, and a particularly cool example of that sort of stuff applied is like the pick up the can scene from Half-Life 2, because it's a uniquely level design driven scene, because it would never be a writer might not consider to combine the game elements to tell that story. They might think of more linear ways of telling it, but a level designer would tell that story using the game mechanics available to them. And the best thing about that scene for me is, he flicks the can off the bin, and he tells you pick it up, and you can make a choice to either pick it up or just chuck it at him, and both of those outcomes are completely valid, and they emerge naturally through the gameplay, and that is to me the most
Yeah.
that to me is just a beautiful example of elegant design.
Yeah, totally. And on top of that, you kind of mentioned this in my GDC talk, how the kind of subtext of those two actions, the idea of obeying him and like or rebelling and throwing it in his face, kind of ties into the themes of the world, and basically the choice that all of the citizens of City 17 have to make, whether or not they kind of rebel against the Combine or obey. And so it's just like I agree. It's like it's so many things at once, but it's also so simple, really. And even in development cost terms, it's an animation and there's a bit of scripting, but it's like super cheap, relatively speaking. And everybody remembers it. It's like it's cool. To me, that's one of the things about level design in general, is that, like, to me, in these kinds of games, the level design is kind of the whole thing. It's what you remember. Like if in no matter how good the game's systems are and any of that stuff, if the levels, I mean, this kind of goes for a lot of stuff, but if it wasn't for the levels expressing the potential of those systems, you'd never appreciate how good the systems are. And it's why level design is always kind of, even after 14 years, and despite my interest in lots of different things about games, I am interested in the narrative side of things, and I consider myself a game designer as well. But there's just there's kind of a lot of stuff about level design which I still feel we haven't really fully explored. And like I imagine games that I'm like, this would be really cool, but we haven't done it yet. And I'm like, maybe it's harder than I think it will be, and it's not. There's a reason it hasn't been done yet, but I still feel like there's a lot of stuff to explore in terms of really level design driven games.
I feel the same, because there are things like there are things that I consider that make games very next gen, and I think when Breath of the Wild came out, it was like the next gen example of like level design being used in a very systemic way, like being able to chop trees down and like cross over rivers, and the combination of being able to pick stuff up and use it to explore and levels and stuff is massive, and I think that can be taken. I think that can be taken so much further from a level design perspective. You can just do more with it, and I want to. I think to be a next gen game, a PS5 Series S game, I think that is one of the things that is going to see huge investment from game developers and resources from big games, is because you can't really make them much more beautiful. That's not going to be the thing that sells copies anymore. I think people are going to want to start seeing stuff that is just super, 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 like it, almost like you're in the real world and there are infinite options. I want to see games just give players more options in the level design spaces and stuff like that.
Yeah, totally. I think that's it's definitely becoming more and more of a thing, with some bumps along the way. There's always been people talking about how single player games are kind of like less commercial these days. But then I literally just today I saw a tweet about how EA are now doubling down on single player games after like canning a bunch of single player Star Wars games a few years ago. And so I think I think those kind of games will always be popular, and like you say, there's a lot to explore in terms of opening things up, in terms of being even more systemic and kind of just open and player empowering in terms of how much agency they have. But I also think I think maybe the thing I'm getting more interested in, or maybe I've always been more interested in, is like doing the systemic game thing, but actually pushing the handcraftedness a bit further, and also and just exploring different settings and contexts. Because I feel like there's, for example, with the Dishonored type game, that kind of template for a game and that set of design values and stuff. I'd love to see a Dishonored like game, but modern military. I've thought about this a lot, like modern military stuff, or a James Bond game. Like those two things I've thought about a lot, where you could totally imagine. I remember I told somebody at Arcane about this years ago, and they were like, "Ugh," when I said modern military. But like, if you imagine a modern military game, but not a Call of Duty, but a Dishonored like thing, where and think about what that means. Where if you apply the idea of like, oh, what if there were situations in a military game where you could deal with them non-lethally instead of shooting, instead of just doing the shooting, as there are a lot of real life, because a lot of based on what I read and what you see in films and stuff, a lot of military stuff is not. Most of it is not the action scene. Most of it is like negotiating and kind of navigating situations with civilians or people you don't know if they're civilians or if they're going to turn on you and all this kind of stuff. And there's a lot of moral judgment involved there, where the choice to not be violent and be non-violent is incredibly important.
Yeah.
And a fundamental part of your job, right? And the idea of a military game where you can make choices, that those kinds of choices could change the story of the game, where there are stealth missions, not because you can imagine like the idea of social stealth in Dishonored with Lady Ball's party and stuff like that. There are situations where I can imagine where that you can have stealth in the traditional sense where enemies are trying to find you, but there's also like the idea of, I'm not blending in because if you're in a military uniform and stuff, but the way that you talk to people can change the way that people respond to you and all this kind of stuff. And then similarly with the James Bond thing, right? Like social stealth in James Bond is flirting in a casino, right? It's tracking down the bad guy while and all this kind of thing, and conversation driven gameplay, and again, non-lethal solutions versus lethal ones, and cinematic gameplay, but that is very systems driven within a very particular situation. I just feel like those are the two areas I'd love to see the immersive sim thing applied to. Partly because it would be interesting to see, because the typical immersive sim games are essentially still drawing from, like Dishonored is a successor to Thief, Prey is a successor to System Shock, and they're amazing. It's like amazing that they've been done and done well, really well. But like, I'd love to see. I just feel like that the immersive sim kind of approach could be applied to lots more, frankly, more commercial premises, like the modern military game or the James Bond kind of spy game. And I'd just love to see that happen. I just feel like there's a lot to explore, and applying those kind of, like I say, especially with like social stealth and non-linear kind of non-lethal solutions to what would normally be an action scene. Basically, I find that there's a lot to explore in that.
Massively, and they're both like thematically they work really well, and as well, like you were saying with Prey coming from System Shock and Dishonored coming from Thief, like they are basic. They feel more like evolutions of the ideas rather than completely like a fresh take on some aspects of it thematically. And I would love to see some of that stuff that you were talking about realized, and I'm really excited to see what comes next for the guys who did Hitman, and I forget the name of the studio, it escapes me.
IO, the ones who are working on the new Bond game.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. See, well, I think they might have beaten you to it. See.
Oh yeah. So they announced that they're working on a story-driven origin story Bond game, which I'm very curious to see how they approach that, given their relatively gameplay-driven Hitman games. I'm curious how they would approach a story-driven game.
It'll be really interesting to see what they do.
Yeah.
But I was going to sort of circle back to something you mentioned previously. So you were talking a little bit about your YouTube videos earlier and thinking about doing a video on elegant design. And I'd love to just have a little chat about why you're doing the videos and what about them you think is useful to you as a dev as well. Because I'm a big fan.
Yeah.
I can't say otherwise. I love that sort of discourse in the level design space, and um, yeah, really great
Yeah.
resource. But I'd love to hear your perspective.
Cheers. Yeah, I mean, I've always been really interested in figuring out the kind of theory of stuff of game design in general, but then obviously kind of specifically level design stuff. Like a lot of people talk about, there's a lot of game design theory floating around, but I still feel like level design discussion and discourse is none of it, not much of it, kind of really digs into what I find interesting about level design, and so I've always felt like I've had something to say about it, and ways of like hopefully useful ways of articulating useful ideas and principles in level design that to me that resonate with me more, because a lot of level design discussion, a lot of the terms you hear kind of thrown around are like things like flow and like guiding the player, and it's all very kind of navigation
Mhm.
kind of focused, and to me,
It's layout driven sometimes, a lot of the time as well.
yeah, layout and kind of how to kind of guide the player over here, and all this kind of stuff. But to me, level design is, it's so many other things, and like like I've never played an amazing level and thought, oh, that was amazing because I knew exactly where to go. To me, that's not the point of. It's not the thing that you get excited about. It's something that should just be the case if it's a game where you're supposed to go in a certain direction. Um, so yeah, to me, I'm trying to find ways to teach it, and I was working on a book for a really long time, for on and off for like a bunch of years, really on and off. But I started to realize that I struggle with the book thing, because if I'm writing a book, I feel like it should be whatever the topic is, whatever the kind of niche of level design it is, whether it's a particular aspect of level design or level design in general. I I feel like if I'm writing a book, I want it to be fairly not. It can't be completely definitive and comprehensive, but I want it to be fairly pretty solid, and like I don't want to feel like, oh man, I wish I said this, and or it doesn't really cover this, or
Yeah.
this only this only rings true for this kind of game, and that kind of thing. So I really struggled with the book thing, but then COVID happened, and lockdown kicked in, and for the first time, I actually got into watching YouTube channels, because I've had friends who gave up on TV years ago, and they just stream
Mhm.
stuff and watch YouTube channels, and yeah, getting into some guitar YouTube channels made me realize like, oh, I can see how like most of the guitar YouTube channels aren't teaching you how to play guitar, and it's none of them start with like, well, this is the E string and this is the A string. It's more just like fairly random topics really, but that all add up to this kind of body of work and a body of ideas, and and combined with the masterclass videos, which a friend got me, kind of gave me his second free pass for.
Mhm.
Both of these things gave me basically new takes on how you could teach level design, or at least talk about level design in a way that's useful, um, and also in a way that is more modular and less kind of challenging. Really, like I say, I find a book really hard to write because I feel like I want it to be perfect in a way, whereas YouTube videos and channels are never complete. You just add bits to them and hopefully it's interesting.
Mhm.
So anyway, those things kind of made me realize like, oh, videos make sense for me, and I like the idea of shooting videos as well because I'm a film geek, and I kind of like the idea of shooting something someday anyway. So like, it was an excuse to get into that while lockdown was kicking in for the first time.
Amazing.
But
Yeah.
yeah, it's good to hear that you're into them and you hopefully find them useful. Like
Yeah,
it's
I think the thing about them is for me, they kind of have like quite they feel it's weird because they feel quite niche. And when I was starting as a level designer, I'd studied games for a long time, but I'd never really focused on level design because that's kind of just how the courses are geared these days. They're quite gameplay driven, and interestingly enough, they're gameplay driven in a way that I wouldn't describe as level design driven. Um, so
Mm.
when I started my first job, I was actually not really equipped as a level designer, particularly. So I was kind of in my first few months scrambling, grabbing all the resources I could, and trying to absorb as much information as possible about level design, and just doing a bunch of levels in my own time as well. But it was really at that point, and that was sort of how long ago would that be? That would be about 3 years ago when I was doing that, and there was really not a lot in the discourse that felt like I could actually really apply that much of it. It was kind of very much like it was a little bit wishy washy, some of it, and you know
Mm.
you read things like you got to find the fun, and like you were saying, guide the player. And to be completely transparent, a lot of that material is quite apparent.
Mm.
You want to make an engaging and fun level, and to be honest, I don't need to be told that that's the design goal. What someone else's whose content I really like is Peter Field's stuff. I don't know if you've seen any of his
Yeah,
content.
yeah, totally.
He when I went to see one of his talks live for an Inter Games event, and um, I think the thing about it is one of the best ways to learn level design is by applying yourself to build your own levels. But a really great way to learn from others is seeing their creative process and how they designed the level, and you listen to their perspective on how they built and crafted it, and what their intentionality was, and you can sort of
Mm.
from that say, hey, okay, that's how they're approaching their problems. Maybe I can borrow some of that or rework it in my own way. And I think that is, in my opinion, that is where the discourse is going to start going in the level design in the world.
Yeah.
Because yeah, go on.
Yeah, I mean, funnily enough, like, yeah, my next video, I just released this one about the level design test that I did
Oh
to join
yes, yeah,
Arcane,
yeah.
to work on Dishonored 2, and that's quite a long video of a lot of where I tried to talk about it in terms of how, well, there's a big section at the start about how I approach the brief, and then I show the level and just kind of try and pick it apart in terms of level design principles and stuff,
Mhm.
and a few tips about level design tests. But I'm thinking of following that up with one where it's just me and the editor showing you around the level as it is in the editor, and then talking about the creative process and stuff like that, because a few people asked about it. I missed that bit out in the previous video in a way. So I'd love to talk about like how I started designing, where I started with designing the layout, and why I
Mhm.
think it had to be like that and that kind of thing. Because
Mhm.
I agree, it's something that's very you don't get to see much of, and especially not you don't get to see much of it in stuff that is from industry people. Basically, there's a lot of like like hobbyists and non-industry people kind of making YouTube stuff, but like what you don't get to see it very often from like from picking
Yeah.
apart levels from shipped games and stuff like that. And I agree. Like one Peter Fields did a YouTube video. Well, I think it was a conference talk first, but he did a YouTube video of talking through his Last of Us level, which is really
Mhm.
cool.
Oh yeah, it's
Yeah,
so
I like
good.
his stuff.
It's so good. I'm
Yeah, yeah.
I'm actually going to do them for Sniper Elite VR
Mm,
because
cool.
there's a really great playthrough of the full game. So I could use his playthrough and sort of pause there and discuss like there are moments in particular looking at the levels where so this isn't one from my level, but this example is perfect to describe one of the other level designers who I worked with. He did this moment where you basically push down from a church into sort of like a war zone area, like where there's like a battle raging, and there's like this fantastic cover point where every single player runs to the cover, runs straight to the cover, ducks behind the sandbags, and then like blind fires over the sandbags. And that moment is just a perfect picture perfect example of how you can craft something in a space through the enemy placement, through the cover placement, through like what is the cover, because the cover is sandbags. I think actually makes a difference as well. And every single player is like running down and like blind firing over and crafting that moment. And I want to talk about how we built those moments. I can't. I probably would have used a moment from one of my own levels, but that example is just too good not to share. Um,
Cool.
so
Yeah, yeah.
looking forward to making those because it's
Yes.
when I was doing the levels and sort of coming up with my design goals, because I'm a big believer in design goals for level design. I think just putting down on paper like a bunch of bullet points, what is this level trying to achieve, is just massive for me. It
Mm.
just frames everything you do.
Yeah,
And
it keeps you
I'd love
focused, right?
to, yeah, exactly that. And I just wanna pick apart some of my levels. And it's also good fun. It's a nice little project and sort of closes the book on the work that you've done as well.
Yeah, that's it. I feel like the arcane because the arcane level design test I did was the only test I've done. I mentioned this in a video that that required me to make a playable level, and
Mm.
so I've got that sitting on my computer, and I just thought it's a shame to not show people that, because there's a lot of level design in there. Like there's a lot for me to that I think would be useful to talk about. And yeah, so I've been trying to dig through what else I could show, and I've got a video of the level design test the thing that I made for the level design test to work on Bioshock Infinite as well, which is really
Yeah.
different,
Mhm.
but it's much more kind of a cool dramatic video than it is like textbook level design stuff. But I'm hoping to make a video about that as well, because yeah, it's just nice to, like you say, it's nice to help people, hopefully, if there are good platforms to talk about useful principles and stuff. But it is nice to kind of revisit them and say, and do a kind of post-mortem of sorts, and kind of, like you say, close a book in a way. Yeah. So I'll see how
Yeah,
much other stuff I can come up with. But,
I think it's definitely worth exploring. I've done a bunch of tests over the years, and you obviously keep a hold of them because you put so much effort into them, and I always feel like maybe what one day when the NDAs are all cleared on stuff, I would love to sort of put some of them out there and talk about them, um, because I just
yeah,
think they're
that's
interesting case studies, because you're kind of putting yourself on paper when you do those tests and saying, this is what you get if you hire me. This is me as an LD, and this is what I can offer you. And I think it's worth sharing those things.
yeah, especially because I think a lot of, I mean, it's one of the things that's really weird about level design, is that it's so different for every game, and therefore every level design test is really different for every studio and project. I think more so, even more so than I think like a writing test would be, or an art test. Obviously they're going to vary between studios and projects, but I don't think quite as much as level design tests do.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so yeah, it just feels like something that is like people would find useful to see, because there's very little visibility. I feel like a lot of junior level design applicants are going into these fairly blind, and they kind of
Oh,
just,
you are,
their
yeah,
first encounter of the idea of a level design test is when they get one, if they get
yeah,
one. And so it's kind
Well,
of hopefully
un-
useful.
unfortunately, that was exactly my experience with it when I started,
Mm.
in games sort of 3 years ago now. And I think so. By contrast, I can't give the name of the uni, but there's a uni that does like a specialized area. I can't even say what area they specialize in, but they do like they're a specialized area in the games industry, but they give their students test examples throughout the course, and they're welcome to like attempt them and stuff. Um,
Mm.
and when I was teaching for the University of Bedfordshire, um, I basically created like a mini design test for the students to do based on tests that I've seen over the years.
Right.
Um, and because for me, I felt like it was an important thing to give the students, because um, if you've never seen one before, the first one is always so intimidating. My
Mm.
first one, I didn't even do a playable level. I did all paper designs, and looking back on it now, it was a big mistake, that because the brief was open to doing that, but I'm a big believer in playable first, and I just kind of sort of was like, I don't know what to do, got to do something. Um,
Well,
and
yeah, and I mean, it's interesting to hear that it wasn't clear if it was supposed to be a playable level, I suppose, because I think
yeah,
that's such a massive thing
well,
that it should be
yeah,
pretty clear. Like I
yeah,
like I say, with the arcane test is the only time I've ever been asked to make a playable, not only make a playable level, but actually just send it to them for them to play on their own, which is really big because then you can't even be there when they play it. So you've got to make it quite legit. But the kind of downside and the risk of that is that it's something I've talked to a few people about recently, is that after releasing the video about it, is that some people were like, especially a couple of lead level designers I know who have made level design tests and stuff, they said like that's a lot of work that they asked you to do, and like in their opinion, way too much. And I was like, yeah, kind of, and I kind of said to them, I think half of it was that the test was asking a lot, but also I put too much into it as well. Like there was a time limit, as I've said in the video, of 15 days, and I really used those 15 days and like overwork, stress myself out doing so. And so, yeah, the scope of tests is quite a kind of delicate thing, especially because I've been trying to think about this stuff recently as a leader, and like getting the scope right and making sure that people, there's lots of things to consider, like making sure people not only don't work super hard and kind of overwork themselves doing this test, but also that you don't kind of design a test that hugely prefers people who have time to overwork themselves. So it doesn't favor, like, I don't know, people who just have all their evenings to spend on it versus at the expense of like cutting out people with kids, for example, who don't have time to work on a test every evening. And so, yeah, there's lots to get right about level design tests. And like I say, because it's so different for every project, it's hard,
It's very difficult. I think the best way to approach it really is, in my opinion, I've done a few tests over the years, and the best one I did was basically you get it on the Friday and you hand it in on for the Monday morning, and basically you work. The idea behind it is you work really hard for 2 days and then it's done. And I really really like that and appreciate that, because you get to put everything into it for those 2 days. Um, but beyond that, it's like you're not sort of like trying to steal time from places. It's focused, and it's enough time to do a good focus level if the test is correctly focused. And I loved that. It was the best test experience I've ever had. Yeah.
Cool.
But really really great stuff there, and I love digging into tests and stuff, because it's something that's not really talked about too often. But to sort of round off the show, Steve, I'd love to have a little chat about your mental health, and would it be something you'd be comfortable talking about on the show today?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I think it's an important topic, and I like that you talk about it on this podcast. Yeah,
No,
sure.
yeah, it's a big part of the show, and it's a big part of sort of something that's important to me, and it's always great that every guest has been open to having a conversation about it. So I thought we
Yeah.
would. This is something that we talked about on the pre-show, but I think it's definitely something great to dig into. And talking about sort of mental health in terms of like ambition, and putting yourself too much into projects sometimes, and all that stuff is it's so easy to do for a certain type of person. And I think we both fall into this trap sometimes. So I think it'd be just a really fantastic thing for us to talk about.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because on one hand, for example, with my videos that I'm making, I feel like I worried with the arcane level design test video, for example, that, like I say, it is the first time I make a video about a level design test. I'm showing this level design test, which is quite a lot of work, and well, loads of work really. And it's partly because the brief asked for it. It's partly because I'm very familiar with Half-Life 2, so I could work quickly in it. But it's a lot of work, and I felt like I needed to point out near the start of the video, this is not normal, and I overworked myself on this test. And you shouldn't do that, and it's a weird one where I feel like I always imagine somebody saying, but it got you the job, right? So maybe maybe that's what people should be doing, kind of thing. You can't regret working on it really hard if it got you the job. And it's a tough one because there's basically a tension. There's ultimately a tension. Like when we talk about being getting good at what we do and really kind of being passionate about what we do and trying to do the best stuff we can, there's kind of a tension to some degree between that and mental health and taking care of yourself. And I, yeah, as we've kind of talked about, I've always, in hindsight, I've always kind of worked a bit too hard. I've always put a lot of time and thought into games stuff, which is partly why I can talk about it. I have a lot to say about it because I've thought about it a lot, and I enjoy the process of figuring it out in a way that I can talk about it and stuff like that. But yeah, there's definitely been loads of times when I've just realized, like, man, I not only am I working, not necessarily working too hard, but putting too much, placing too much importance on how good my work is or how good the game is that I'm working on, relative to how much it might be doing my head in to try and reach that standard, or or worry about it not reaching that standard. And so it's just like, yeah, it's just kind of, it's really, I kind of feel like I've learned a lot in the last couple of years, I suppose, partly from doing therapy a couple of years ago. Just kind of how my personality is kind of, it helps me in some ways, but there's other ways where it doesn't help me. And like I say, there can be that tension between trying to, and it's not necessarily a good thing. How to put this? Like, it makes me think of, have you seen Free Solo, that climbing documentary on Netflix?
No, I haven't.
There's a guy called Alex. I can't remember his name. Alex somebody. And basically, the documentary is about a guy who is a super good climber, insanely good, and he's also into free solo climbing, which is climbing proper like outdoor cliffs and stuff, but with no rope. And so, if he makes a mistake at any point after the first few bits, he will likely die. And that's just, it's proper like extreme climbing. And the documentary is him doing, oh man, is it El Capitan? Like one of the biggest climb, basically, one of the hardest ones in the world. And the documentary is filming him trying to do it for the first time without a rope. And so there's a lot. It's a pretty bonkers documentary because he got some of his friends to film it, like professional cinematographers and stuff. And they're talking about how, like, when we film this, we might end up filming our friend dying. It's it's pretty bonkers. And but an interesting aspect of that documentary is that it digs into his personality and his relationships with girlfriends and stuff like this, and his childhood and stuff like this. And it's not mega explicit about anything, but you do get the impression that there are quirks to his psychology that not only enable him to do the kind of bonkers stuff like this, but kind of motivate him to do it, or give him a reason to be interested in it. Whereas I'm not interested in the idea of proving that I'm such a good level designer that I would do it in a way that means I would die if I make a mistake, and like, but
Yeah.
I think it's a good example of how, like, I think certain personality traits that push you to get really into things and get good at stuff, they're not always good ones, or they can have bad sides to them. And like, I think, there's that, yeah, like you kind of said in the question, like, I think there's it might be that a lot of us in the games industry have that kind of personality. And I think it
That was
might
exactly
relate.
what I was going to say.
Yeah, because right down to the fact that games themselves, a lot of them, not necessarily the story-driven ones, but 90-something% of games, you could argue, are achievement-driven, right? Books aren't achievement-driven. Films aren't achievement-driven. And being interested in paintings has nothing to do with achievement. But games, by enjoying them, you are pushing yourself to achieve all of these goals and feeling like you've lost, or it's game over, or you've failed if you don't achieve stuff. And I think that feeds a certain mindset, which, like I say, can have positive sides to it. But you wonder, but for people who really love games that are like that, surely it must have an effect, right?
I think it does. And I think the thing about it is the potent concoction becomes when you put these creative people who are also want to sort of push the craft as well, and they're naturally drawn to achievement driven medium as well. I think it can create a type of person. It sort of like naturally appeals to someone that wants to work really hard. And I think seeing. seeing the industry push forwards and sort of evolve over the coming years. I think the relationship between devs and crunch is always a complicated, really really complicated topic. But I think seeing how that changes over the next sort of the next period of the sort of the next era of video game development is going to be quite interesting.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah, yeah,
because
yeah.
I see a lot of young devs who push against crunch, and then I see some who go the opposite way as well, and it's very fascinating.
Yeah, it's complicated because there's lots of different types of crunch.
Well, yeah.
There's different degrees of like how much overtime. It is like doing an hour or so overtime every few days. Is that crunch, or is crunch when there's that end of it, and then on the other spectrum, there's like companies telling you, "Sorry, we've really got to start working 7-day weeks," which I've never done, thankfully, but I've done 12-hour days before on a project, Monday to Friday, not weekends. But like, yeah, and also there's crunch. There's working a lot of overtime when it's kind of when your studio head has told you to do it in a studio meeting, or there's working overtime because you're a solo indie and you're telling yourself to do it, or you feel addicted to your work, or maybe you're really enjoying your work, or you're incredibly stressed because you're not sure if the game's working out well. And so there's loads of different, crunch is complicated.
It's
But
really
I think,
complicated.
yeah,
I was going to say, so the one of the interesting things I've heard said about this, and this really resonated with me, is kind of like crunch is only really the business of the people on the project, um, because because like you were saying, the relationship between the devs and what's going on is so complicated. Like, is it just a few hours here and there? Is it 12-hour days? Is it pushing for a milestone? I think it can be, yeah. It's always a tricky one.
yeah, and I think, yeah. I mean, for what it's worth, I'm super against it in the sense of like any prolonged, like even ethical issues aside, like I think significant overtime for any longer than a couple of weeks just becomes counterproductive anyway. Um,
Mm,
but I think 1 week of like, can we all chip in and kind of get this thing done for this milestone? That can be quite motivating and kind of
mhm.
build a nice sense of team and camaraderie and actually produce quite good memories. Whereas like long, horrible, proper crunches does not produce
Yeah,
good
the
memories.
the the
But like,
famous death marches and stuff are just a bit like,
yeah,
they
yeah,
just seem like madness now, don't they? They just
yeah, yeah, yeah,
just
um,
doesn't work.
yeah,
But yeah, in regards to mental health and crunch, though, I think it's always, it's when it starts making like a big dent in your mental health where it gets really dangerous. And as well, it can also be because you're working. Sometimes I've met devs, and I've done this personally as well, I'm not ashamed to admit, where you work your day job and then you come home and then you do additional work. And
oh yeah, like personal projects. You mean?
yeah, exactly, because you're
Right?
passionate about what you do, and you want to build your skills, and you want to make something that's yours, but you've also got your day job. And um yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
the funny thing about it
yeah.
is, you kind of have to go through it before you really realize that can be a terrible idea.
Yeah, and it's something to do in moderation. Like moderation is
Yeah,
one aspect of it, and then there's like, yeah, just remembering that half the time personal project stuff is still work. Like it's not relaxing, or it can be relaxing, but it's often not, and it is really easy to just completely misjudge how much you can get done with a personal project, and then find yourself doing overtime kind of being overworked at work, and then overworking yourself as well at home and all this kind of stuff. And it can get nuts. And as a freelancer, I remember, I mean, it wasn't really personal project stuff, but like just in terms of whenever you're doing more than one project, it can be, if you're juggling like different contracts and stuff, like it can get really easy to completely underestimate at least one of those things, and for it to just get ruinous because not only are you not working on it all the time, so you're running out of time, but also your attention is on two different things. So the degree to which one is going off the rails can slip by you kind of easier. And yeah, you can. yeah, I mean, even with like my YouTube videos, which I'm really happy that I'm into, I've gotten into, because they feel like a lot like they feel like what a lot of my career has been leading up to in terms of like my output and stuff. And I enjoy that they're very personal to me, and that I can finish them way quicker than games. That's really satisfying. But then I do find myself in phases, and my girlfriend will attest to this, like where I'm just like, I really just want to keep working on this video, and then I wake up tomorrow and I'm like, I want to get it a bit more done, and I'm almost getting there. But then like more work always just ends up coming out because you want it to be good. And I've had to kind of really slap myself on the wrist a couple of times and say, nope, this video is not that important. Just like nobody notices if you release this a week later or 3 weeks later. Don't work too hard on this, and try to keep it fun, and satisfying, and not like this grueling thing. But yeah, it can be. But when it's satisfying for other reasons, because it's a personal project and it's personal to you, and it can be, it can be even harder and more pervasive than work, kind of becoming too much in a way. Yeah, it's.
I feel very similarly, and I think that's like a really great place to sort of wrap the show, mate. Thank you ever so much for coming on the show. I think we've managed to talk about some really stuff that I'm really excited about and really interested in, and I hope the listeners have enjoyed listening to the episode just as much as I've had recording it.
Yeah, cheers. Me too. It's good chatting.
Yeah, likewise. Do you want to plug your Twitter and your YouTube channel and stuff?
Sure. Yeah, on Twitter I am ESSELL2. That's SL2. And people never know how to spell it based on how I say it. And basically, if you YouTube search for Steve Lee Level Design, I come up. I think that's the quickest way to find it. But yeah, that's it. That's me.
That's you. Fantastic stuff. I'll pop all that stuff in the show description. And I would like to once again thank Plus2 Initiative for the amazing work and helping me push the show and podcast even further. Please do give his Spotify a look. It is linked below, and his debut EP is out now. And if you love lo-fi as much as me, you will have a fantastic time. And I would also like to give a little shout out to my little brothers, Charlie and Jamie, who are the show's biggest fans. And they criticised me for not getting this episode up sooner, so I thought I'd give them a big thumbs up. But yes, this has been the Game Dev Garden. Thank you ever so much for joining me here today, where we talk about deep conversations, game development, curiosities, mental health, and wherever the dialogue might take us. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you all next time.